Hello everyone, this video is from one of my tournaments that I had in the past couple of years. And this was in a classical time control but in-person tournament in Idaho. So in this playlist so far, I've had all the games be in the classical time control. The past two videos were classical time control but in online games. But this one is in an in-person event. And my opponent here, out of respect again, just keeping the initials of the names. My opponent got his title of National Master before 1991, and I believe he got his Candidate Master title in 1993. So my opponent is an elder person, and I just wanted to show you this game, which was pretty nice. It has some good ideas that you can probably apply to your own games. All right, so the Queen's Gambit starts with 1d4, and then the opponent responds with d5, and you go for c4. And here you may be thinking, wait, you're just giving away a pawn. But if they were to capture a pawn, that you can try to, you can say that you're controlling the center after a push like e4. You have both pawns in the middle, and then this pawn from your opponent that will be here on c4, you will be able to capture it soon after. All right. So a gambit means that you are giving away a pawn for active play of your pieces, and you will be able to get your pawn back at 1 point. All right, or not just giving away a pawn for free. And here, by the way, Queen's Gambit declines means whenever we go after c4, our opponent doesn't capture right away, but they just go for the push e6. If you were to capture here, they can just capture back. Okay. So here in this tournament, I was going for this approach where I was just capturing the pawns right away. And I would go after with knight c3, my opponent develops his knight, and I go with bishop f4. And the idea of bishop f4, not just going for e3 right away, because if I were to do e3 right away, my bishop would be looking at my own pawn, right? So it's nice to have your bishops outside the pawn. So after bringing the bishop here, then you have ideas of pushing the pawn forward to e3 or so to release your other bishop, right, the light square bishop. So here my opponent went with a6 because at one point I want to go like this and then bring the bishop, but mainly like the idea right away of why doing a6 is so that I don't bring my knight here to b5, right? And then try to go for a pawn here on c7, which could be annoying, right? Anyways, so I go with e3, and my opponent, is telling me, what do you want to do with your bishop? Do you want to move it again, or you just want to trade? Here some ideas would be, if I don't want to capture right away, I can just bring my bishop back here. And that's a very common response. You just bring your bishop back, and if they were to capture it, you capture with the h pawn, and then your rook is open. And at one point, you can have ideas of maybe bringing the queen and then castle long or something, and go for an aggressive approach. Here I just captured, and then I just develop my knight. And then my opponent goes for knight b d7. Here, if my opponent were to go with bishop g4, I think one of my moves will be just bishop e2 and then try to go for a trade of bishops. But here, after my opponent went with knight b7, I don't have to go h3 to prevent any pins on my knight because the knight is currently blocking the bishop. So sometimes we think, oh, here I just want to prevent any pins, but there are no pins happening right now because the knight is just blocking the bishop. So that would be, not saying a wasteful move, but might as well just develop a different piece, right? So I go for bishop here. Now if my opponent were to move the knight, now I can go for h3, and now my bishop has a nice diagonal here, right? Okay, so my opponent castle and I castle. He developed the rook, and I go for a little battery situation here. If the knight were to move somewhere, I can just capture this pawn here on h7. I wouldn't capture it right away because my opponent can just capture back with the knight, and I'll be down a piece. So here, let's see, my opponent went g6, and g6, the idea of g6 is kind of nice because you may be thinking, oh yeah, you're pushing the pawns forward in front of your king, but I also don't have a dark square bishop, so I cannot really take advantage of the dark squares. which in this case, it's not too big of a deal for my opponent, right? Because at one point he has some ideas of maybe moving the knight and then going for f5 and going for an attack, right? So I developed my rook because my plan is that I will, like right now, my queen is looking through extra vision at this c7 pawn, right? So if I were to move my knight or something, then I can try to capture this pawn here on c7. My opponent did a prophylactic move, and we cover what prophylaxis means in one of the videos prior. So if you don't know, or you're not familiar with what prophylaxis means, you should check that video out. I'll put it in at the end in the end screen. Okay. At the same, I also put on the end screen the tournament where I had this game, because I've already posted this game in a previous video. So okay, I developed my other rook, and now both of my rooks have been moved. I've developed them. My idea of rook to e1 is that I would like to push this pawn forward, right? Maybe not right away, or maybe like the next turn, right away I can just start pushing this and start opening up some files, okay? Because that's where the rooks belong. They belong in open files. So here my opponent went with king g7. Kind of like a waiting move, right? I wasn't sure what was the point of this move, to be honest. But I just developed my other knight. Just not develop it, but just move it for a better square. Sometimes when we don't know what to do, and that's something very common, right? We don't know, okay, after this, we're in this position here as for the white pieces. What do we do now? What are some plans, right? So my ideas would be, maybe I would like to reroute my knight to some other squares. Or maybe, you know, like have ideas of maybe bringing my knight here, bringing my other knight here, and then going for like a check. If they were to capture here with the pawn, I can give another check, king or queen or something. Have ideas like that. So I have like some plans of moving my pieces, and you can think of like where would be your pieces like the best, like the most ideal squares for your pieces, right? And you can try to think of, okay, I'm gonna move them there. How can I move my pieces over there, right? Here my opponent brings the knight to e4, like an outpost. And his idea is probably to then bring the other pawn here to f5, right? So here, if I would like to attack their knight, they won't probably capture my knight, but they will go for the move f5. If I were to capture with the knight, if they capture back with the pawn, my two pieces are forked. So here I capture with the bishop because I said to myself, the knight will not move. So I would like for him to capture back here with, if he captures with the rook, I can just develop my knight with tempo, attacking the rook and having a better control of certain squares. But in this position, my opponent captured back with the pawn. And here I just have to move my knight, attacking the pawn. And how can you defend this pawn? It's not so easy to defend, right? Because if they bring if my opponent brings the knight here to f6, I'm thinking now I bring my other knight to g3, attacking the pawn even more. He would have to bring the queen, maybe here or something, and I can just like slow play it, right? Okay, so my opponent went for f5. f5, in my opinion, at the time of the tournament, right now the position is plus 0.8. Big advantage for the white pieces, but I need to be careful, right? But at the same time, I'm seeing that my opponent has connect 4, which connect 4 usually wins you the game. In this case, it's everything in front of their king. So their king is very weak. In this position, I went with queen c3. If my opponent is not careful and has like a move like, let's say, h6 or something, I have a discover attack by pushing the pawn forward. And then if the queen wants to, you know, defend or something, the check, I can just capture the queen. And then after the knight captures or something, I can just capture this pawn here on c6, and I will be winning the pawn. So you gotta always be careful with what your opponent wants to do. All right. So here, another prophylactic move. My opponent brought the knight here to f6 because now I don't have this discovery attack. If I just push this pawn forward, my opponent can just capture with the queen, with the pawn, with anything, right? They gotta be careful too. So here I attack my my opponent's queen, and here we have to be thinking about, like, prior to this move, we need to be thinking, this is an ideal square here, e5, and we have two knights, right? If we can bring one of the knights over here to e5, that will be ideal. That'll be amazing. How can we bring it? We can think of, okay, if we have this is the square that we want to get to with the knight. We can do a reverse engineering approach for this. From here, how can we get to this square where the knight's currently, right? So we can do this jump and then this jump, which means that if we do it the other way, we can jump this way and then bring the knight here, okay? Also, what's another idea? In this current position, what's an advantage for the white pieces? Take some time to think. Pause the video right now. If you thought of one of your knights being way better than your opponent's pieces, you're correct. You're right. Because they have a light square bishop, and the majority of our pawns for the white pieces here are in the dark squares. So somehow, if we can trade their knight for one of our knights, our knight will always be better than the bishop, because the bishop cannot really target your pawns. And then once you get that exchange, you can try to put all your pawns on dark squares, right, at one point. That way their bishop can never hit any of your pawns. So that's what I did. In this position, I went for knight c4, hitting the queen, and then pushing the pawn forward. I don't want to rush with bringing the knight here yet, not yet. But here I'm just gaining space, because if I were to go for something like this, they can probably go with a push here of a pawn. So here in this position, I just went with b4. It also controls at one point like this push here, right? So now if they were to push, I can just capture here with the b pawn, even with the d pawn, and open some files, right? So I'm gaining the space. And here my opponent went with the move knight d5. Knight d5 is a nice move because it's also fixing the d4 pawn, and I cannot really push it forward. Also attacks my queen and my pawn at the same time. But here I can just retreat, keeping the extra evasion here, you know, attacking the king through extra evasion. And then my opponent here went with the move queen e7, hitting my pawn. So now the knight and the queen are both hitting my pawn. Here, according to the computer, I think the better approach would have been just rook b1. Rook b1 is one of the moves. Knight f4 is also another move that I don't understand, because they can just capture this pawn. But if we can think a little bit more about it, maybe you're activating some pieces and stuff, and your pieces are just more active, which is nice. You can go for some tactics in that position, right? Also because at one point, if the knight were to capture or something, you have a discovery attack here, right? But here I just went with a3. Apparently, if you let the computer run for a while, a3 is one of the top engine moves, which is super nice. So a3, very, you know, calm approach. And here, after my opponent went bishop d7, I bring my knight to e5. And here the idea is that I thought about it, right? My knight, if I can go knight against bishop, we're gonna be good, because all my pawns are in the dark squares, the majority of them, right? Except g2. So if I can trade the knights and then play knight versus bishop, my knight will be stronger than the bishop, right? So that's what I did. My opponent went h5, and I went with knight c3 to trade this knight for my knight, and then go for the knight versus bishop. My opponent didn't do anything about it, and I captured the knight. And in this position, we're currently at plus 1.1. If we have the correct play and follow the full sequence for the rest of the game, right? According to the computer. So that was nice, because now I don't really want to trade my knight for this bishop ever, unless it's necessary. But right now my knight is way stronger than the bishop, so there's no need. So here I go for the trades, and I just want to trade all the pieces, because I know that my knight's going to be way stronger than the bishop for the rest of the game. But here my opponent blocks. And we can try to think of, if I capture, my opponent may just capture with the rook. And if I captures, the position is just a draw. And there's not much to play for here, right? Everything's kind of locked. And the queen can always just protect any infiltration from my queen, right? So here I just bring my rook forward, because I would like to create a battery and complicate things for my opponent. And my opponent just defends the rook with the queen as well. Maybe he would like to create some battery of its own. And here I go for this move, queen c1. The idea of queen c1 is that if my opponent doesn't do anything, let's say they move the king somewhere, I can always just capture this. If captures, I just win a pawn in the end. And then I have a 2 versus 1 for the end game, and I can just try to push my pawns forward. Correct? So here, the current position is plus 2.67 for the white pieces if I just keep on the sequence. My opponent goes for queen d6. Queen d6, he's just trying to play like a turtle, you know, like just cover himself up, try to go for a draw, because if anyone's playing for a win, here is the white pieces because of the better activity, like better placement of the pieces, especially the knight here. The knight's very strong here. And here, I should have gone for a move that I played later on, but this was the time to play it, just right now. I should have gone for h4. I played it later on, but I should have just gone for that, because if we go h4, if they ever push here, you can just capture the pawn forward, and now you're infiltrating onto, like, you know, dark squares here. You can bring your queen, maneuver here and there, right? So I should have done that, but instead I went for the move a4. What is the idea of the move a4? If my opponent were to like not do anything, of course he's gonna do something, right? But let's say nothing happens, they push the pawn forward or something. I have this move b5. Since I have a battery here of queen and rook, if I go for b5, after my opponent captures, I capture, the bishop is pinned to the rook. Because if the bishop were to capture this pawn, right, or just move away, I can just capture this rook here. If the queen captures, I just win a queen, I just win a piece. So that was the idea of a4. And if my opponent captures here, a free pawn, I still capture the rook here, and we'll be up material in this position, right? So my opponent cannot really rush by capturing the pawn or retreating the bishop yet. So my opponent just moves this rook, and in this position I can capture this bishop, right? And that's one of the ideas. It's not one of the top engine moves. Why? Because if we were to capture this bishop, if they capture back, if I capture this pawn at the end, attacking the queen, they can capture this pawn here. Although I can, after thinking a little bit, my rook can also capture here on a6, and I will be up a pawn, right? Which, thinking about it, I think that's kind of nice, and I should have probably gone for something like that, to be honest. Then I would have to go for h4, so I prevent any background checkmates. So after thinking about it, maybe I should have gone for something like that. But maybe there are in-between moves that I'm not really thinking about right now, or what my opponent was calculating as well, right? So in this position, I go with queen c3, and I blunder my pawn in this position. Now my opponent captures my pawn. But because of the placement of my knight, the position is still plus 0.3. Meaning that even though I've lost a pawn, I'm down a pawn, the white pieces are winning because of my knight. It's a very good placement of my knight and my active pieces. If the rook ever comes here, I can just capture, I won't be up a piece. So my opponent's stuck, up a pawn, but still stuck. So here I tried to I finally made the move h4, which I should have done a long time ago. Because if anything, I can always just go like g3, and my king is always safe there, okay? And I tried to bring my queen around, because now I'm planning on targeting this pawn and targeting this pawn. I'm down a pawn, and now the position, because of the play of my opponent, the position is at plus 0.67. Down a pawn still, but we're still winning, because now I have this move. After my opponent went king g8, and I'm not sure why he went for king g8, but I have this move, knight takes c6. I know I said that I was not gonna capture the bishop, but even if you don't believe it, that's actually a top engine move, which I'm glad I found, to be honest, because we're down a pawn, we need to make a comeback, and this brings me back to plus 2.4 or so advantage for the white pieces. Because after my opponent captures, I capture this pawn here on a6, and now I have a pawn that can be passed. And this is a very weak pawn here on c6. And I have very active play. So sometimes we can think of what makes a position good or not. And a lot of times the most important thing, to be honest, is king safety. My opponent's king is not safe at all. It's very open here. There is like nothing really in front of him, like no pawns that protect it, like my king, for example. Right? Although the opponent's queen is always looking at h2, so any rook infiltration can like lead to checkmate because of a back rank problem. But my opponent's king is very open. So if I can reroute, my pieces here to these files, I can try to give some checkmate or maybe win material. And that's what I did. So here I am attacking this c6 pawn like this. And my opponent defends it like this. I was calculating him maybe defending it like this, but that wouldn't be so great because if my opponent were to go with rook c7, I was probably thinking of just moving b5, and if they were to capture here, I can just win a queen, right? So that's not so great for them. And I can just even like capture and in the end have a passed pawn. So my opponent went like this, but I still go for b5, right? And here my opponent captures. Here I have to do an in-between move. I can just capture the queen and capture the rook, or sorry, the pawn with my rook. But this position is pretty, I don't know, like same amount of pawns are kind of locked. It would be a draw, I think, right? But it wouldn't be ideal because I'm not going for a win if I just trade all the pieces and it's just an even, similar structure of pawns, same amount of pawns. What's the point? I'm not playing for a win here. So I have to go for some imbalances and go for some risks that hopefully pay off. And here I have this move, rook c8 check. Rook c8 check, you cannot really cover with your pieces, right? Because if you were to cover with the rook here, you can actually start with a check and then capture the queen or something. So here my opponent brings the king forward. And here I was thinking, and this is what was going on through my head. If I can somehow bring my queen here all the way to, let's say, g8 or something, or h8, but mainly f8. If I could bring my queen to f8, that'll be almost checkmate, right? Because if I can bring the queen to f8, I give a check. If the king goes there, that's just a mate. But the problem, and the problem with f8 is that the queen is covering f8, right? So in this position, what I was thinking is that the critical square is f8. But the problem is that the queen's block is defending it. So I thought, first of all, I'm going to capture this pawn because I might as well just capture this pawn, right? And after my opponent went for this move, f4, trying to get some counterplay to go for some push like this and maybe just try to queen or something, I have this move, queen b7 check. And I was hoping that my opponent would go for rook e8, or rook e7, which is also the best move. It's a top engine move. And that's what my opponent did. Rook e7. Now we're looking at the critical square f8. f8 is no longer protected by the queen. So I go for this move, queen a8, trying to be sneaky. The advantage drops a bit, but my opponent doesn't see it. My opponent doesn't see my plan. And he goes for pawn captures e3. Pause the video and try to find the sequence that wins. Only one sequence is plus 6.39. Everything else goes to a draw or advantage for the black pieces. Pause the video, and when you're ready, I hope that you were able to find the forceful continuation. Let me see. Rook g8 check. Rook g8 check is a beautiful move because now the f8 square is no longer defended by the queen, so we can infiltrate. And you may be thinking, let's look at different moves here, right? So what happens if the king goes here to h6? Now we have the move queen f8 check, right? And then if the king were to go here to h7, now you just have a checkmate here with rook h8 checkmate, because the queen is also covering here g7 and here. So what happens if the opponent blocks here with the rook only move, right? So now you can just capture this pawn, sorry, the rook with the queen, and that's a checkmate because our pawn here on h4 is also playing here in the sequence for the checkmate, you know, blocking here g5. So we can even do it like that, or we can also have a nice checkmate with, we don't even capture the rook, we go with rook h8 checkmate. The pawn covers here g5, and the rook can no longer here defend the other attack because it's pinned to the king, right? So here, let's see another sequence here after this check. That'll probably be it. Actually, let's see what happens if king f7. Then we have queen f8 check, and then we can try to win material. My opponent in this position went with king f6, which is about the same as king f7, because we then follow with the move queen f8 check. If let's say if the rook goes here to f7, we can capture here the queen with check, right? We capture the queen with check, and if the king moves here, we have queen g6 check, and after this we have queen f7 checkmate here in this position. Capture everything, and the pawns are also playing here. You know, this pawn on d4 also covering e5. We have a beautiful checkmate like that, right? So what happens if the king goes here to e6? Then we will capture this g6 pawn with the rook, and we would win the queen, because the king has to move away, and then we just capture the queen with check. You have to capture here, and you will be able to, and then you just capture the pawn here, and you will be able to win, you know, queen versus rook with the same actually you're even up a pawn in this position, so you're up a pawn and you have the queen against the rook. So that's what happened in the game after I gave the check. I believe my opponent went here, or I think after the check my opponent resigned. I'm not sure if it was in this position or after my opponent went to e6 and I just captured the pawn on g6 and my opponent resigned in this position, because it's just totally lost. You're either winning the queen. Actually, in this position, you're just winning the queen, right? Which is the least of the worst for my opponent. But it was a beautiful game. I was able to defeat a title player in this game, in this tournament, and that helped my, you know, it like gave me hope that I can play some good chess against strong players, right? So I hope you like this video, and as you may have noticed, I don't have anything in the background here anymore, and it's because we're moving to a different state, and I'll be working on my doctorate, and I'll be streaming on Twitch, which is something that I've been wanting to do for a while, but I'll be able to do those live streams over there from my new place, new home. Okay, so I hope you guys liked the video. I hope you got some ideas for critical squares and the things that I've talked about in this game, what plans to do or what things, and activation of pieces, you know, discovery attacks or plans or things like that. So if you have any questions, please write it in the comment section. I always respond to any questions you may have. And you know, if you want to talk chess, then I have a Discord channel that is also in the description. So please follow, like, and subscribe, comment, and share with the friends these games, and check out the rest of the channel. All right, I'll see you guys on the next one.